You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What up, y'all? It's Joe Budden, here to talk about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to win real money while watching football. You can get up to 100 times your money.
Prize Picks will give you $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Just download the Prize Picks app and use code SPOTIFY. That's code SPOTIFY on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play a $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
Earlier this summer, Trump made history in the worst of ways by being the first sitting U.S. president to federalize a state's National Guard and deploy them through improper channels against the protests of a sitting governor when he sent troops into California during the protests of ICE deportation activities in Los Angeles and elsewhere. At the time, I was writing about that mass deportation campaign, and my sentiment was that this was the ultimate revelation of the Trump regime's fascistic authoritarianism, transforming the armed forces into the leader's own national police force. It was something I'd warned about in advance in my two-part series called The Looming Threat of Fascism, in which I drew parallels between the threat posed by a second Trump term and the rise of Italian fascism and Nazism in Weimar Germany. To quote myself, I said then, almost exactly a year ago in September 2024, that even during his first term, Trump more than once threatened to deploy active-duty military domestically, considering declarations of martial law openly during the George Floyd protests, asking, according to his Secretary of Defense, why he can't just have soldiers shoot protesters. And according to one Homeland Security official, as well as the findings of the January 6th committee, he also considered declaring martial law on January 6th in order to help bring his coup to fruition. These threats became more and more transparent during his most recent re-election campaign, with promises to deploy troops to the southern border and to invoke the Insurrection Act in order to use the military as a domestic police force, all while promising retribution and explicitly stating he would arrest and jail lawmakers and attorneys who helped prosecute him. These were the reddest of authoritarian flags, and he immediately made clear upon taking office again that they were not mere rhetoric. On January 20th, he issued executive orders declaring an emergency at the southern border and, quote, clarifying the military's role in protecting the territorial integrity of the United States, end quote, as if defining the role of the military were a presidential power. It's not. For example, power is not given to the chief executive to just declare that the Senate will now be run by four-star generals. Presidents just don't get to restructure such systems with the stroke of a pen, or at least they're not supposed to be able to do such things. The issue at hand is that he has turned active duty military personnel into a de facto border police force, and the use of the military for domestic policing is expressly outlawed by the Posse Comitatus Act. As troop presence at the border steadily grew, there was talk about how this seemingly unlawful act should be addressed by Congress or the courts. But since then, the issue has somewhat faded, as Trump's use of the military as a domestic police force has just become more and more brazen. In June, when protests against a surge in ICE raids erupted in LA, Trump sent in the National Guard despite Governor Gavin Newsom explicitly telling him not to, and he didn't even bother invoking the Insurrection Act, likely because even he knew that the nonviolent protests did not amount to an insurrection. Some 300 National Guard troops remain still acting as security for federal facilities, despite a federal judge ruling that their deployment had been illegal to begin with, citing the Posse Comitatus Act and its explicit prohibition on using the military to execute domestic law. But before that judge had even gotten around to making the ruling, Trump had declared Washington, D.C. to be lawless, despite statistics indicating a year-over-year decline in crime, and deployed the National Guard in the Capitol, where there is no governor to protest, only a mayor whose power is very much circumscribed in this regard. And as he executed his will, filling the streets with a standing army and military vehicles, mostly to just stand around and intimidate the public, he threatened to do the same to 4 other Democratic-governed cities besides Los Angeles: Chicago, New York, Baltimore, and Oakland. Now he's been posting explicit threats on social media to make quote-unquote war on Chicago. He recently rebranded the Department of Defense as the Department of War, using the name of an old cabinet department responsible for army operations. Then he shared a social post with an AI-generated image featuring the title "Chipocalypse Now," that being a combination of Chicago and the film title Apocalypse Now, depicting himself as the belligerent character Bill Kilgore, played in the film by Robert Duvall, and most famous for the scene in which he leads a napalm strike. In the text of his post, actually typed out by our president, or maybe some dumbass social media intern named Huge Nuts, judging by the young incel idiots he likes to employ. The message was, quote, "I love the smell of deportations in the morning. Chicago about to find out why it's called the Department of War," end quote, followed by 3 helicopter emojis. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who, like Newsom before him, urged the president not to send troops to his state, responded by saying, quote, "The President of the United States is threatening to go to war with an American city. This is not a joke. This is not normal," end quote. And these are my sentiments exactly, as I spoke about at length in the last episode. This is unprecedented. We can look throughout American history, and rather than seeing any parallels that indicate this is acceptable behavior by an American president, we find example after example to prove that this is perhaps the most un-American thing Trump has ever done. This is historical blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I want to emphasize that I don't blame our servicemen and women for what's happening now. Veterans everywhere are standing up and protesting these deployments, trying to remind all National Guard troops being illegally deployed this way that they took an oath to the Constitution, not to the President. Thank you for listening to Standing Army, Sitting President, the Posse Comitatus Act, and the domestic deployment of the military. Before we continue, I want to thank my newest patrons on Patreon. Thank you, Jacob D., Marcus Mode, and Jess Gray. Thanks to all my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on the conspiracies surrounding U.S. entrances to war, I delved deeper into the claims of advanced knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack. And after my episode on gerrymandering, I took a further look at which party is more guilty of partisan redistricting since the reapportionment revolution. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. To clarify what I mean about Trump's use of the military against citizens being his most un-American act, I should first acknowledge that there are numerous examples we might point to of Trump being the most un-American of U.S. presidents. From sentiments he has espoused, to rights he has infringed on, to his general disregard for checks and balances, and his treatment of the Constitution as an impediment to his consolidation of power. Chief among his un-American activities, it can be argued, was his incitement of an insurrection in an effort to unlawfully remain in office. But the use of the military against U.S. citizens chafes American ideals in a way that harkens back to the infancy of our country. The use of British soldiers against protesters in the American colonies was one of the original controversies that sparked revolutionary action. After the French and Indian War, in order to pay for the continued presence of British soldiers in the colonies, Britain tried to impose a tax on the colony with the Stamp Act of 1765, a law that would require any printed material to use stamped paper from London. The very notion that the colonists could be so taxed without having any say in Parliament sparked controversy, with the well-known slogan, "No taxation without representation." A few years later, Parliament tried to get around this by instead imposing tariffs. 5 acts were passed by the British Parliament, the Townshend Acts, which imposed import duties on goods like paint, paper, glass, lead, and tea. But just as today, when the American people protest that since tariff cost is passed on to the consumer, tariffs are no different from taxation, colonists then rejected the Townshend Acts, declaring that quote-unquote internal and quote-unquote external taxes were the same. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia organized a boycott of these imported goods. In Boston specifically, where protests were spirited, British soldiers were stationed at the Custom House to protect officials enforcing the Townshend duties. The very presence of the military on American streets came to be resented, and eventually violence erupted. One soldier cracked a young wig maker's apprentice on the head, sparking protest and drawing a large crowd. More soldiers came as reinforcements. The crowd of colonists shouted at the soldiers and began to throw small objects at them, and the soldiers eventually fired their weapons into the crowd. 5 civilians were murdered in the Boston Massacre. One of them, Crispus Attucks, a man of Native American and African heritage, later became an icon, especially in the abolitionist movement, a man of color standing on principle against oppression, who was one of our country's earliest martyrs. The entire event would prove to be effective in galvanizing the cause of national independence. After our independence was achieved, one of the first issues that the Founding Fathers dealt with was how to handle the Continental Army they had raised. Should it remain as a standing army or be disbanded? How then would an army be raised again in time of need? These were important issues with which Britain had been struggling over the last century, dealing with questions of who had the power to raise and keep an army, a monarch or the Parliament. The 1689 English Bill of Rights would prohibit a king or queen from keeping a standing army in peacetime, unless Parliament allowed it. In practice, though, because of near continual conflict, a standing army was kept and was stationed in the American colonies. One of the chief complaints in the Declaration of Independence was that the king, quote, kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, end quote. Our experience with the standing armies of the British, especially the massacre of protesting citizens, resulted in a focus on citizen militias in the Articles of Confederation. Rather than invest anyone with the power to keep a standing army, it called on each state to, quote, maintain a well-regulated, disciplined, and armed militia, end quote. Essentially a citizen army that would only be mobilized as necessity demanded. It is from this alternative to standing armies that we developed our problematic right to bear arms, which, as the Constitution explicitly states, was only intended to make possible, quote, a well-regulated militia, end quote. But the framers of the Constitution also saw fit to invest the federal government with some power to raise an army, specifically giving Congress this power. But in an effort to avoid the problems that came with having a standing army in peacetime, they limited the raising and supporting of armies to a term no longer than 2 years. Later, still dwelling on colonial grievances over British standing armies being stationed among us, the Bill of Rights included the Third Amendment, which stated that, quote, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, end quote. This was in direct opposition to the British Quartering Act, which less than 30 years earlier had forced American colonists to house and feed the soldiers that had been stationed among them. As can be clearly seen, the aversion to having military stationed among us, especially to police us, is deeply embedded in American culture, even though we have long had a de facto standing army, continually refunded every 2 years to maintain our military power. One of the reasons that it was felt a stronger federal government was needed and that reliance on citizen militias maintained by the states may not be sufficient was an early insurrection, Shays' Rebellion. In the late 1780s, a Revolutionary War hero, Daniel Shays, led groups of farmers in open rebellion against the state government of Massachusetts. These farmers had not been entirely compensated for their service in the war. And then, when Massachusetts had to pay its share of the war costs, it taxed these destitute farmers, foreclosing on their land when they couldn't pay. Shays laid siege to courts in Northampton and Springfield, forcing their adjournment to stop the foreclosures. When Shays tried to seize an armory in order to overthrow the state government, a militia force faced his men down and suppressed the rebellion. The fact that Shays had raised his own militia of 1,500 men, outnumbering the militia stationed to guard the armory, forcing Massachusetts to raise money and recruit a larger militia, highlighted the idea that perhaps a stronger standing military power needed to be maintained, as well as a more powerful central government that could respond to such threats. This revelation of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation contributed to the decision to replace it with the Constitution a few years later. And in 1792, Congress passed the Federal Militias Act, which empowered the president to federalize state militias and command them like a standing army in emergency circumstances like Shays' Rebellion, allowing a more robust and organized response to such an insurrection. This law was pretty immediately invoked because of the ongoing Whiskey Rebellion. Excise taxes on whiskey had been imposed in 1791, and rural distillers on the frontier refused to pay. Eventually, in 1794, a U.S. Marshal came out to western Pennsylvania and tried to serve papers on these farmers for resisting taxation, leading to an armed force of 500 men attacking the home of a tax inspector. While President George Washington sent some negotiators to speak with the rebels, he also used his powers under the Federal Militias Act to raise an army of 13,000 soldiers, easily putting down the rebellion. 13 years later, Congress enshrined the president's ability to mobilize troops against rebel citizens in the Insurrection Act, which gives the chief executive the power to not only federalize state militia, but also to deploy regular armed forces against citizens, but only, quote, as he considers necessary to suppress in any state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy," end quote, that may hinder the execution of laws. It's this law that remains the mechanism by which the president is empowered to federalize the National Guard and deploy them in American cities. And if you think that it is loosely worded, giving him free rein, quote, "as he considers necessary," end quote, in such situations as he might define them, you're right. It grants considerable license to the president in this regard, for it was perhaps not considered that an American president would ever just claim a conspiracy or insurrection existed when in fact there was none. And this power was strengthened thereafter in the 1827 Supreme Court case Martin v. Mott, in which a farmer appealed his case for not reporting for duty when the president mustered the militia for the War of 1812. By that ruling, quote, "the authority to decide whether the exigency has arisen belongs exclusively to the president," end quote, meaning the president alone can unilaterally decide when it is, quote, "necessary to suppress," end quote, some perceived threat. Indeed, Martin v. Mott has been cited in recent court cases surrounding the Los Angeles deployment. In the end, the judge barred Trump's use of troops in California, but this precedent will likely come up again should the Supreme Court consider an appeal. Now for a brief intermission. This summer, use your sunscreen, don't get burned, and try something new. Make some new summer plans. Check out a new beach, barbecue something different, vacation at a new spot, and don't get burned by your old wireless bill. Be like me. Switch to Mint Mobile and try out their epic summer plan, which gives you the coverage and speed you're used to for way less money. For a limited time, Mint Mobile's offering 3 months of unlimited premium wireless for just $15 a month. So beat the heat of all those other wireless plans. While your friends are sweating over data overages and surprise charges, keep cool with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network without those jaw-dropping monthly bills. Best summer ever? Compared to my old wireless service, Mint Mobile's the best provider ever. I saved enough to pay for my summer vacation. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight?
Aha!
Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Now, back to the show. Perhaps the most prominent example of a president deploying federal troops against residents of the country was the Civil War. President Lincoln invoked the Insurrection Act, and certainly it seems a valid use of this power, since it is hard to view the Confederacy as anything other than an open rebellion against the authority of the federal government. Indeed, viewed one way, as soon as southern states seceded and asserted sovereignty as a confederacy of states independent of the U.S., they renounced U.S. citizenship rights. Therefore, from a technical viewpoint, one might consider military deployments in this war to be a conflict with a foreign power seeking to seize U.S. territories. But of course, this is an oversimplification, since among many Northerners, the goal was reunification, and the fight very clearly was between fellow countrymen. However, the Civil War does furnish another example of the militia being used against U.S. citizens in the New York draft riots of 1863. This began as a protest over the institution of a military draft, one that especially affected the white working class, since Black Americans were not yet considered citizens, and since the affluent could easily pay a few $100s to avoid being drafted. The white working class, especially Irish Americans and immigrants, were already feeling great tension, since the recent Emancipation Proclamation meant, in their view, that they would soon face increased competition for work. So while the unrest began as a protest against the draft, it soon turned into a race riot, with the homes of many Black residents of New York and known abolitionists being burned down. President Lincoln ended up having to pull troops away from Gettysburg to quell the riots and retake control of the city. Lincoln did not, however, invoke the Insurrection Act in this case, as these were New York State militia he sent back from the front. He had federalized these troops to deploy them in Pennsylvania. He was not deploying them in their home state against the wishes of the governor there. But the 1861 additions to the Insurrection Act, made to strengthen presidential powers in this regard, would have enabled him to bring the military to bear regardless. During Reconstruction, federal troops remained stationed throughout the South, and with the 14th Amendment now guaranteeing rights and equal protection to freed slaves, these troops were frequently used to combat the terrorist actions of white supremacists, specifically the Ku Klux Klan. Ulysses S. Grant explicitly invoked the Insurrection Act in order to combat the KKK because local authorities were often uncooperative and didn't want to see these white supremacists brought to justice. In fact, in many cases, to quote a favorite band of mine, some of those who worked forces were the same that burned crosses. In order to organize an effective response to the threat of the KKK, Grant actually had to seek further amendment to the Insurrection Act. In 1871, in the Ku Klux Klan Act, Congress drastically expanded presidential power to use the military to enforce domestic law, enabling him to not only deploy troops against the citizens of a state, but also the power to suspend habeas corpus, which he immediately did, sending federal troops into South Carolina and detaining white supremacists without charging them. It's important to note, though, that these were emergency powers, granted only temporarily, and the governor of South Carolina at the time, Robert Kingston Scott, very much invited federal aid in putting down the KKK conspirators. Grant would end up numerous times in the ensuing years having to intervene militarily in southern states, typically after contested elections, when white mobs, angered that the election didn't go their way, tended to grow lawless and massacre Black residents. After Reconstruction, these white supremacists returned to power and worked to establish a system of institutional racism and segregation that became known as Jim Crow. And in Congress, senators from rebel states sought to limit the president's power to send troops into states and force them to comply with federal norms. At first, these Southern senators didn't have the support they needed to pass any such law. But then, railroad workers went on strike across 6 states in 1877, and President Rutherford Hayes invoked the Insurrection Act. Granted, Hayes sent federal troops into these states at the requests of their governors, but still, enough senators chafed at the use of the military against labor activists that they joined with Southern senators to pass the Posse Comitatus Act, which declared that, quote, "It shall not be lawful to employ any part of the Army of the United States as a posse comitatus, or otherwise for the purpose of executing the laws, except as such cases and under such circumstances as such employment of said force may be expressly authorized by the Constitution or by act of Congress," end quote, establishing a fine and potentially a 2-year term in prison for those who violated the law. A posse comitatus was essentially a group of citizens rounded up by a sheriff to help administer justice, just like in Western films. The thrust of the law was that Congress was to have oversight of when and whether a president could use federal troops domestically as a police force. That is why the Posse Comitatus Act has recently come under scrutiny. Trump's deployment of troops in California was alleged to have violated this law, and that is indeed what a federal judge recently ruled, that the Trump regime knowingly used the military to execute domestic law, making of them a kind of national police force, which is against the law. The most prominent workaround of the Posse Comitatus Act, of course, would be the Insurrection Act, already well established, which would allow the president to use the military with or without a state government's consent to suppress an actual insurrection. But Trump did not invoke this, and, of course, there was no insurrection. It seems that he has been relying specifically on the National Guard for these actions because he or some in his regime believed that the old militia acts give the president the power to mobilize and federalize the National Guard, which is the equivalent today of state militias. But the very moment that Trump federalized the Guard, especially against the governor's protests, which meant those troops were no longer under state control, they effectively became federal troops and thus were subject to the Posse Comitatus Act. No matter how you look at it, Trump did not follow the law in his domestic use of the military this summer. There's no shortage of loopholes or workarounds when it comes to the government's ability to use the military domestically, as the years following Reconstruction and the passage of the Posse Comitatus Act demonstrated. In fact, brilliant historian Heather Cox Richardson recently made a very apt comparison, suggesting that our current historical moment is very much like the Gilded Age, the end of the 19th century in America, from the late 1870s to the late 1890s. As today, it was an era of great wealth inequality, when the rich were getting richer and the poor slipping further into poverty. Advancements in technology, specifically industrial technology, meant mechanization and the elimination of unskilled labor, or what today we would term technological unemployment. The tech bros of their day, like George Westinghouse and Thomas Edison, drove innovation and industrialization. And in the case of Edison, he was very much an Elon Musk sort, taking credit for the innovations of others and capitalizing on an unearned reputation, claiming to be a brilliant inventor when really he was little more than a cutthroat businessman. And while today the world is controlled by billionaire oligarchs bent on using the levers of government to benefit themselves, back in the Gilded Age, it was the industrialists, the fantastically wealthy robber barons, Rockefeller and his oil, Carnegie and his steel, Gould and his railroads, Morgan and his banks, Vanderbilt, Guggenheim, Stanford, Mellon. Their names ring down through the decades, more than a century later, still rich, still powerful, And throughout the Gilded Age, these robber barons used their power and influence to enlist the aid of those in government, who gladly lent them the military might they needed to put down their striking laborers. In 1892, when miners went on strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the governor declared martial law, sent in the National Guard, and also invited federal troops to join the party. That same year, the Homestead Steel Workers went on strike, and the governor sent in the Pennsylvania National Guard to protect not the strikers, but the strike breakers. In 1893, in one of the very rare instances in which a president sent in troops over the protests of a sitting governor, President Grover Cleveland invoked the Insurrection Act and dispatched federal troops to put down the Pullman strike in Chicago, despite the governor of Illinois urging him to withdraw the soldiers. Even then, though, unlike Trump, Cleveland, rightly or wrongly, used the correct statutory mechanism for the military action. By the end of the century, back in Idaho, the Army was just occupying the entire Coeur d'Alene mining region. It was a time of obscene wealth wielded by corrupt men who turned the U.S. government and, by extension, its armed forces into their personal servants. Sound familiar? But there is hope. If today is like the Gilded Age, as Heather Cox Richardson has suggested, then perhaps that means another progressive era is around the corner. After the assassination of William McKinley, whose high tariffs had effectively shielded and grown the wealth of robber barons, Teddy Roosevelt rose to power, and progressive reformers fought the corruption of the political machines whose gears had been greased by robber baron money. The progressives worked to democratize politics and limit the power of corporations. This is exactly what we see the progressive wing of the Democratic Party pushing for today. And as before, it may be our only path out of this mess. So maybe there's hope in the face of the jackbooted thuggery of the Trump regime. Maybe within our lifetime, we will see the pendulum of American politics swing hard back against fascism toward the ideals on which the country was founded. Thank you for listening to Historical Blindness. I'm starting a new professorship that will demand more of my time, and I may struggle to find time to devote to the podcast, especially between September and December. I'll let you know with announcements if there will be any delay. But this summer I've been busy. I now have all my episodes on YouTube as videos, so if you prefer to listen there, it doesn't really help my download numbers, but you can do it. However, a handful of old episodes aren't available because of copyright strikes owing to some clips I used in them. I've also started releasing some short video content, just a couple so far, across my social media. I hope to find time to produce more of those, the idea being that they may drive discovery of the podcast. Lastly, I'm struggling to migrate my old blog posts to Substack. The import isn't working on their website, and manual copying looks very time-consuming, so I'm just not sure where to go with that right now. If you like going through my transcripts of episodes or looking through my sources or the images I post on there, I apologize that no new posts have been made for recent episodes. I hope to figure this out eventually. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons: Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT LTD, Jamie Nielsen, Wizard in a Tower, Martin Robistow, and Josh Haberman. Thank you, patrons, for sticking with me through these several months. These episodes have been like a scream in the darkness to me. They've kept me sane and have helped me find insight and perspective on the craziness of the world today. And I hope they've done the same for you. I will now be taking a break and doing something that, if you've listened for long, you know I love to do this time of year, and that is dig up some spooky stories in October. I hope you can use the break too and enjoy what I'll be covering. But to be sure, I'll be following the news and thinking about upcoming episodes. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, we can find parallels for much of what Trump has been doing in American history, but we can't find precedent. Every time, the situation is incomparable, and it must be emphasized that what's happening now is not normal.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
Spend less time staying in the know about all things gaming and more time actually watching and playing what you want with the IGN Daily Update podcast. All you need is a few minutes to hear the latest from IGN on the world of video games, movies, and television with news, previews, and reviews. So listen and subscribe to the IGN Daily Update wherever you get your podcasts. That's the IGN Daily Update, wherever you get your podcasts.